All right, I think we are ready. So thank you for taking just a minute there. So I'm Zach Hawkins. I am the Title I Federal Program Director and Private School Ombudsman here at the OPI. And thank you for joining us this afternoon and for all you do for your students and for your school and for your community. This event I had blocked out for 2 hours. But based on the previous two, I would suspect that we'll be done about 4:15 or so, unless there's lots of questions. And if there are, that's totally fine. But that's just kind of how it's gone so far. I should mention that I also have with us, I have Mr. Andy Boehm. He's going to talk in a little bit here about the non-public school database and you access that and your information into there. That's something that I've had a lot of questions on since I started in this position. So he was gracious enough to join and talk through that. Also, I have the chat up. So at any point in this conversation, if you have a question, you can just go ahead and type it in the chat. I'll be monitoring that. And when I get to a good point to stop and address that, I will do so. But with that, I'll go ahead and get started. So just a little bit about myself. I grew up in very northwest Montana, up in the Yak Valley. I went to high school in Troy, Montana, and then on to college at MSU, so go Cats. And my first professional teaching job was in Hays, Montana in 2000. So I've been kind of in this thing for about almost 25 years. I also taught in Hart Butte for 3 years. And in that process, met my wife, who's from here in Helena. And we have 2 boys. They're now 15 and 12. But when I started here, when we moved here, I was originally working to get into the Helena School District and sort of in a roundabout way, ended up in college access programs, federal college access programs, did that for 12 years. And for those of you that might be familiar with the Gear Up program, I was the director of that for 5 years, but came over here in OPI in 2018 to be the Indian Ed for All director. And then on March 11th, so just in the last 6 weeks, have stepped into this role. So I'm by no means an expert at all of this stuff. I will just throw that out there. But what I will say is that if you do have questions, I will work very hard to make sure that I get you answers and and that it's sound advice. So just a little bit about myself. And so as part of the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, it is a requirement that every state have a private school ombudsman, and their role really is to make sure that the needs of those eligible private and homeschool students that are eligible for title programs are met, and to assist private schools if they feel that they're not being treated fairly or equitably, but also to really serve as a facilitator in this relationship between the public schools and then the private and home schools that they're serving through their title set aside funds. So our agenda for this, I'll talk about how the participation works, just a quick overview of Title I, and then how eligibility works for schools and students, a little bit about just solid partnerships between public and non-public as in this process of serving students, kind of the annual timeline and the critical things that come up at different times of the year. And then I'll have Andy will talk about kind of how that non-public school database works. And then the bulk of this presentation will be on that consultation and planning piece. And I'll talk about some of the other title programs a little bit. What is equitable share? And then I'll talk a little about e-grants. And then I'll, at the very end, I'll take you onto our website and you can see where some of the things are located and the forms that you might need in this work, where you can find those. So again, so the ombudsman is a requirement, but it's in response to section 117 of the ESSA plan, which says that LEAs must provide services to eligible private school students if requested. And then it's really it's a state to state thing, but in the state of Montana, home schools basically are the same thing as private schools. So that's just the way the law is in our state. So they have to receive the same consideration as private schools. But those services also would extend to teachers and also families. So in those parts of Title I, the family engagement requirements, those would extend to family members of eligible non-public school students, but also teachers who are serving those eligible students would be need to get all of the sorry, was there a question? Okay. Teachers should be teachers should be able to access those PD events and those things that would be provided to those public school teachers who were serving eligible students. And so then the share has to be equitable. So basically what that means is that whatever that number of non-public students is, the per student amount set aside for those students should be the same as the per student amount for the public school students who are also being served. And then the services have to be equitable. So, they have to be comparable. It has to be clear that what those public school students are receiving is very similar to what those private school students are receiving. And then, because a lot of non-public schools may be faith-based and somehow in their nature or in their constitution, the services have to kind of stay outside of that. They have to be secular, neutral, and non-ideological. And those words will come up a lot, but those are the three words that you should always be thinking about when you're thinking about questions around these services or different parts of the plan or things like that. So Title I is really the largest federal program that is designed to address the achievement gap between students, just sort of mainstream students and students who are underprivileged in some way, who have poverty issues, other issues that have negatively impacted their educational attainment. The original Elementary and Secondary Education Act came out in 1965. That's what established Title I as an entitlement program. Now we've had different iterations of this. For those of you that have been around for a long time, you probably remember No Child Left Behind. But now we have the Every Student Succeeds Act. And so that is really the current guidance that we are following and that we need to be following as we work through this process. Again, the services should be supplemental for those students. That's another big one. Supplement, not supplant. They should be provided on top of regular classroom instruction. And they should that supplement, not supplant. So everything that you're doing should be on top of the normal educational programming. So how do schools and students participate? So the students must reside in the participating public school attendance area. So whatever that public school district boundaries are, those students need to reside within those boundaries. They must meet the eligibility requirements to be served. So, there's kind of two pieces to that. There is, there must be some type of poverty measure that they meet, some threshold that they meet. Generally, this would be free and reduced lunch, but they could be things like TANF, or if there's a census poverty count done and they're part of that count of identified as poverty, they have to somehow meet that eligibility. And then based on that eligibility, when the public school gets their title allocation based on that formula, of eligible students, those private school students are counted in the allocation, and then taking that equitable share, there's a set aside that the public school puts, in a separate pot, basically, to serve those non-public students. And so this question of eligibility should be partly, it should be a conversation between the private and the public school to make sure that has been identified, what we're looking at. And then the other part of it is the students, in addition to meeting that poverty count, there should also be an academic deficiency, even if they're in poverty, but they're on all of their testing and everything else, they're scoring, proficient or something like that, then they wouldn't be necessarily eligible for title services. All right, so I see a question: with the new open enrollment legislation, does this impact the home district? I'll have to be honest with you, Molly. So you are in Missoula, right? And so there's some districts, and you can always unmute yourself or
I just unmuted.
yeah. Okay.
I just don't know with open enrollment, now kids can apply to go anywhere. So on that first bullet point where they must reside in a participating public school attendance area. Well, what is a public school attendance area?
Right.
Open
So
enrollment.
I would think it would be based on the local policy. So,
Okay.
if the local policy is that, the attendance area is outside of it's open enrollment, so they're outside of that district, but that they would still be eligible that way. I think that's what that would, how that would work. And then I see a question too: do they have to have an IEP? Not necessarily. If they don't, if they meet, based on those assessments, they meet that, they're somehow academically deficient, then they would still qualify even if they don't have an IEP. Well, you guys are hitting me with the questions. That's great. This is the first group that's really been firing them like this. If we are school-wide, does that make all private school students in our yes, I believe regardless of whether you're targeted or school-wide. Okay. So your question is, would that mean that any student, I believe the answer to that is no. They would still have to meet those eligibility requirements. That school-wide would only apply to those students who are attending the public school. But that's a good question, and I'm going to make a note to look into that. But off the top of my head, I'm going to say the answer to that is no. Not everybody is automatically eligible. All right. Any other questions before I move on? So just want to touch on this really fast. I think these are just some important things to be thinking about in that partnership between the public and the private entity in providing services to the students. Just making sure that there's common understanding about the rules, the regulations, the processes, the requirements, timelines, all of that stuff. And that there's lots of communication back and forth to make sure that everybody's on the same page and has common understanding about everything. That is one of the things that I've, a lot of the calls and emails that I've fielded thus far have been around, well, I'm kind of new, or I didn't know they were doing this, or we had a number of situations where folks didn't enroll, or they didn't sign up last year, but they went ahead and still served those schools, even though they didn't do the sign up process, because they just had that relationship, and now they're trying to get it all fixed now. So just making sure that that there's that common understanding and communication, and everybody's on the same page. And obviously that's part of what this is intended to help with. That consultation process is done effectively. That's it's a big process of communication and collaboration between the public and the non-public entity or entities, to make sure, that you've effectively identified all of the students by agreed upon measures. You've identified, what programs are going to serve them, what programs, how those services are going to be provided, all of those types of things that are taken care of in that consultation process, so that all the contingencies, all the, every step in the process throughout the year has been discussed and planned for. So you're not, as you go through the year, running into, things that probably could have been talked through at the beginning. That, the services are really tied to needs and plans. All of the services, title services, you have to be based upon the identified needs. So that process has to be effective. And then at the end of the day, it really should be around what's best for the students. That's really important. Sometimes in this process, we all get buried in this work, and we're dealing with, the state agencies, local education agencies, private agencies, the federal government, all of that stuff. And at times it can get overwhelming and frustrating or whatever, but we always are here to do what's best for students, and we need to keep our eye on that. Another question: what if a child in private school needs speech therapy? Can they now receive it? I don't believe, I'll have to double check on speech therapy. I don't know if that is a Title I service or not. I kind of don't think so, but I could be wrong about that. So let me check on that. If anybody wants to, if you want to stay on at the end, we can talk more about that. Maybe I can dig into that, or we can set up a time to talk more about that. I don't know, because I'm wondering if that would fall more under like a SPED thing or something like that. But I'll check on that. All good questions. Thank you. So a little bit about the annual timeline. So we just kind of wrapped up. I know we were a little late this year, but getting those participation agreements. So basically in March, the public entity needs to reach out to eligible private and home schools, let them know about the availability of title services, and basically give them an opt-in option. And then, for those that opt in, then they would enter them into the non-public database, which is how we at the OPI, we track what schools are participating and how many students and that sort of thing. And then also to document if they didn't respond, if they chose not to participate, to make sure that you have that documentation, because it is really the way the law is written. The onus really is on the local LEA to have that documentation that they made a good faith effort to provide these services to interested parties. And again, that right of complaint that the other, that the private entities have, that's kind of what if there's an investigation, it's going to a lot of it's going to be around documentation. Were they ever notified of this? What evidence do you have that they were notified or not notified? That sort of thing. So then in May through July, so basically between now and July 31st, is the consultation period. And at the end of this period, I will need copies of the consultation and interlocal agreements, and I'll show you where those are on the website at the end. If you are not going to, for whatever reason, be able to make that July 31st deadline, please let me know. I can provide a little bit of an extension. I understand that sometimes things come up. What I have heard just through the grapevine is that a lot of schools, they do this consultation process kind of right after school gets out. That's a good time when things are slowed down a little bit, and there's more time to kind of, come together and work on it and just basically make sure everything gets done and gets done efficiently and effectively. But July 31st is the deadline to get those done, and then it is my job to review those. Because part of that is I have to sign off on that when the final allocation goes into e-grants. And then in July and August is when the public schools report the actual number of private schools that are going to be served. And then in October is when private and home schools report their actual numbers to their county superintendents. So now I'm gonna take a little break from talking, and I'm gonna turn it over to Andy, and he's gonna talk a little bit about the how the non-public school collections go.
Thanks, Zach. I'm glad we had all the people here today. So going back to what you said earlier, Zach, about the special ed. Special education is one of the programs that they can sign, that the non-public schools can sign up for as part of the federal programs participation. So I don't know who runs it per se, if it's titled, but it is one of the options for that the public schools send to the private schools, and that the private schools can sign up for. The IDEA Special Ed Part B and Special Ed Part P.
Okay, so the answer to your question is yes. If well, and speech therapy would fall under that, I believe. So
If there's an IEP.
Yeah. Yeah.
And for all the private schools, all the IEPs are run through the serving district.
Okay.
Yep. Andrew and Zach, this is Carol in Great Falls. We do both. We serve the kids with IEPs, speech, and other educational services through this one program. So it's not separate. We have a consultation. We talk about what they need.
Okay. Well, thank you for clarifying that. I appreciate it.
Yes. So yeah, there's not just title programs. There's also a low ed program and school nutrition programs and striving readers that are a part of the spring program participation that private and home schools can sign up for in the spring to work with the public schools the following school year.
Okay.
So we have a non-public database that we are in the process of reviewing and redesigning to hopefully make it easier for everybody, including getting sign up and new users and getting rid of the old users. But for right now, it is set up to where there's only one person. We only want one person from each system to have an access. It should be the AR, or the AR will designate someone. So if we can go to so basically here's the address for the non-public database, and the screenshots you'll see here today may look a little different than ours, as we have access to more things and more schools. You're only going to have access to your district, your system. So this is what it looks like. You put in your username, which comes in the yearly email that we send out every March. Usually it should be in the 1st of March. It was a little later this year. And then for your password, you just click on reset password every year when you come in here. You can set up your own, but then it expires every 30 days or every 60 days. And so when you're only in here a couple times a year, it's probably just easier to reset password every time. So yeah, reset the password. We're not going to send you out that. You can go ahead and get that set up anytime you forget or expire, and they expire after 60 days. So when you come in here, you're going to want to select non-public school under the OPI secure portal. You're probably not going to see as many of these as you see right now, but you want to look for the non-public school one and click on that. And data entry and reports are the two tabs that you're going to want to look at. So data entry in so when you click on that one, the first thing you're going to see is the fall enrollment, and that is what the county soups fill in as of the October count date of all the homeschools and private schools in the county broken out by system. They enter in the system and they enter in how many students, broken out by how many students are in K-8 and how many students are in 9-12. So then in the spring, you would enter in the spring program participation, and there it'll just have your homeschools and what programs that they want to sign up for. And if you're as a district that don't have all these programs, they can only sign up for programs in which the residing district, the home district has. So if you don't have striving readers, then you don't have to, if they sign up for it, they can't take it because you don't offer it. In terms of the questions of the website address. So unless you have an account, it's not, you're not going to be able to log in, but we can certainly provide that address at the end there, or I can get it in after I'm done speaking. Just remind me at the end there. Basically it will go, let's see. So Andy, you're probably going to get it because you are the superintendent or the principal. So you should get a yearly email from us in March saying that this program participation collection is open. And so it would have your account in there. And I know that you've been the superintendent there for a couple of years, so I would imagine that you do have an account and do have homeschools or private schools in your district boundary, and so you do have to do this collection. And so unless you had schools participating in this current year in the 23-24 school year, you're not going to have to do any of the things in the summer that Zach has mentioned or will mention. So yeah, fall is the county soup, and then in the spring, it'll have all the list of all the homeschools and private schools that have registered as of the October count date, and that's what we want. If they've registered earlier, they're not, or excuse me, not earlier, but later in the school year, then they're not eligible to participate in federal programs the next school year. And so you have that list of home and private schools. To get the address for them, you can go to the report tab and select reports or enrollment report, and that'll have the addresses for all and the family names of all of the home and private schools within your district. And then you would send them a certified letter with all the programs. And we'll get to where to go to get all that information.
Okay, there's a couple questions that came up here, Andy.
Yeah.
So just to follow up on that boundary question, so I think again, and I can look at it, I can look and see what the SS says. I think it just says, again, in the attendance area. So to me, that would be however that's defined.
I think only those, I think that it only is for students in private schools within your boundaries. I don't think the private schools have a choice, that they can't choose what public school to be a part of. It has to be within their boundaries. And I believe, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure that it can only be within those boundaries. You can't kind of like shop for a district to do your federal programs.
And then the other question was, are home schools and private schools available in the system right after October? Or is that not available until March?
Basically, we don't really, I mean, and that I guess would be more on you, Zach, and if you want them in the program prior to March when we open it up. And a lot of times things aren't ready.
Yeah, I think we would want them to, because my understanding of this is they register in October, but when we send out basically the eligible list that we provide, or that is based on that October count. But I would not be for kind of going outside of the timeline of this process to have schools decide that they want to sign up whenever.
Because I think what the county soups send or in this new process will upload me all their homeschools, or they could still enter them in manually. And then we have to QA the data and get rid of duplicates and make sure that it's uploading properly. And then we have to set up the actual program letter. There's a new program letter every year and new programs descriptions, and that's usually not finalized until February or so, right before we send out. And then we have to make sure that we have all the right contacts, updates, security, where we can see that it's clearly been a change. Because the way the system is now, and hopefully it won't in the future, is if someone leaves, we don't know about it unless they request a new security login, in which case then we'd update that there. So usually we don't want people in there prior to March, because we're still either updating, we don't know what programs are available or what the programs look like or who the program person is. Okay. So here's what it looks like, and you would sign up for when the schools send you back that information, you would come in here and mark what districts are what have signed up for what. And if you don't hear from anything, you would click no response. And at the bottom, you would click if they do not wish to participate. And some counties will ask that when they register in the fall. And then there's a check when they enter in those schools to mark that they do not wish to participate. And in which case they're not going to show up on the drop down. So you don't really have the choice. The district's going to be is probably just going to be grayed out, and then for your schools within your district boundary, you would select those, and you do have to do it for every single one. At the moment, there is not an upload to upload these for all of it. Oh, if we can go back a second here. So if you click on the blue writing where it says private school equitable share information document, that has, so if you go on to, now you can go on to the next page. So this area has the letter and more letter from Zach, which all required, basically a schematic of the instructions on how, and then it has a list of all the programs, including the contact information. And then it has the sign up sheets. So if the districts are interested in participating, they would fill this out, sign it, and send it back. So like the private schools and the homeschool would fill it out and send it back to you. It used to be a time where that would come directly to me or to the AIM office, but now as part of, it's further along in the process and gets sent to Zach later on in the summer. It's not sent, but you would enter in that information into the non-public database, and then I would send that information to Zach on who all signed up by the count date or when the data is steady. There is not a snapshot process for this, so we just decide when it's done, and we just cut and paste into a spreadsheet, and I send the results to Zach. So you'll definitely want to click into that blue writing and get, kind of what's the instructions and what's going on and descriptions of all the programs, which they change throughout the years. And then there's new contact people. Let's see, were any of these latest questions relevant? Let's see here. I'm pretty sure we got that all cleaned up, so maybe it's not the right one, and there might have been a part or two that did have wrong dates, and we're pretty much past the time when anyone can go in and do anything if they haven't sent out the forms to the schools in their district. And I also think Helena Flats is a district that doesn't have any private schools, only home schools. And as a rule, they don't generally participate. So here's the letter for this year. And it is the schools that send out the certified letters to all the home and private schools within your district boundary. which you would get from running the report under the report tab.
Yep, and you know, and obviously that's just a way, again, for documentation purposes. That they received, you know, that notice of that's available. So that you have that for your records. Next slide, Andy.
Yes, please. So once you go into the reports tab, it again has the addresses, and then also once you've entered in all the programs or the non-responses or do not wish to participate, you can come in here and run the spring program participation report, and it'll kind of a QA, a second way to make sure that all the schools that did sign up, and those that did not, and make sure that you got all of them in there, because even if they're not interested, we still need record that there either was no response or they do not want to participate this year, and that needs to go into our database. So it's kind of part of the QA process. Okay.
So I think that's it for Andy. Excuse me. Are there any other questions for Andy before I move into consultation?
So let me get that email out there for the secure portal.
Yep. And one other thing too, I will, this one is being recorded, so this will be available on our website. But also, I will be creating a PDF of this slide deck and send it out to everybody who signed up for one of the 3 sessions. So Valerie has a question, says, how do we know if it's saved? Oh, in the database, how do you know if it's saved?
Yeah.
I guess that's where we want you to run the report to see. You know, and every school is a little bit different. There's some schools we expect there to be program districts that have schools that do participate, and we keep an eye on those. But if some districts just have a handful of home schools where you don't really look that you've done anything. But I would run that report to make sure before you put it to bed that you've entered in all the data that you need to by running that report. In theory, it should just save, or you have to hit the save button. Let's see here. So being programmed, you enter in the program, and then there's a box that says save federal participation. So you would click on that, and if you click on it, it will save. It generally it doesn't say anything, but if you click on that, it will have saved.
Could they go back and look at their is that what you like?
Yeah, they could do it now. They could look and see what they've entered right now by going into I mean, you could even go in there by hand and kind of look at it, even go dropping down and get the list of schools and click on the school, and then you see below what was checked. Or you can go into the reports tab and run the federal program participation spreadsheet, and that'll show what each private school had signed up for.
All right. Any other questions for Andy? All right. Well, thank you, Andy, for being
You're
here
welcome.
and for helping me through some of this stuff too. So yeah, let's talk about the consultation process. So that's kind of where we are between now and the end of July. That has to be done between the public and non-public entity or entities. So again, just going through all the key issues again, what which students will be served, what programs are applicable to those specific students. How are they going to be provided? Where are they going to be provided? Are there supplies and materials that will be associated with that? Is there PD that has to happen associated with that? Does that PD require travel? Are the students going to have to travel for the services? Just all of those nuts and bolts things should be part of that consultation conversation. And it should be a two-way street in terms of both sides kind of talking about what's going to work, what their thoughts are on it. It doesn't mean that there's always going to be 100% agreement, but there has to be a meaningful conversation that happens that's really, again, grounded in doing what's best for the students within the parameters of the resources and the situation that's available. And so again, it should be, the whole point should be to better impact the student achievement. Some requirements under the law that have to happen, that have to be talked about, is how will the LEA identify eligible students? So again, you know, if it's not free and reduced lunch, if it's not a census poverty count, is it because the family's on TANF or some other type of public assistance? How are you identifying that eligibility in terms of the poverty piece? What services specifically will be provided? Will it be a pullout? Will be like a tutor? Will they have a special math or reading lab that's paid for by title? All those types of things. And again, the LEA is, all of this comes through the LEA. No funds go to the private school. They don't hire. I mean, if they hired a private school person, it would have to be some type of out of contract situation, something like that, as a third party contractor. But it all comes through the LEA. And then what method and sources of data will they use to identify them, particularly when it comes to, that academic deficiency piece. What assessment data are they going to be looking at to identify that need? Also, how are families and teachers going to be served of eligible students in this process? And then what are the delivery mechanisms to provide those services? And then again, is it going to be a staff person from the LEA who's going to go out and serve those students? And it's going to be, that portion of their time will be taken out of that equitable share. Is it going to be a third party? Is there going to be a contract or an MOU or something like that that's going to be used to provide those services? All of those kinds of details would be talked through, are required, I should say, to be talked through in the consultation process. Just some general information also. So the meetings should be open under the Montana Open Meetings Law. That there should be a signed affirmation at the end where the private school says, yes, we did have meaningful consultation. That's the documentation, again, that there has been fidelity to the law and to the process. That it should be ongoing. And again, I was talking about planning and all of that, but we all know that things do come up during the year, and so sometimes maybe the plan has to change, and maybe there will be a need to come back together to discuss a specific issue or circumstance that's arisen and get that resolved in a productive way. Again, the private schools do have the right to complain. That does come through me, and then I would kind of investigate, everything and, talk to both sides and request documentation, all of those things, review the consultation agreements, those types of things. And then the private school does have to have access to e-grants, and the main reason for that is so that they can go in and verify that equitable share set aside is accurate. So if they were told it's $15,000 and they want to go into e-grants and verify that that's what's in there, they can do that, so they know that that they've been told the right information, essentially. Yeah, how do we give them access to e-grants through OPI? That's a great question. Yeah, that's another one I'll have to look at, because I don't know. I would assume so. I would assume that somehow we set them up with access to that, and that we would work with our e-grants people to do that. So my initial answer to that is going to be, if you get that request, send it my way. Oh, Andy's already looks like responded to that. They can go, oh no, that's excuse me, that's not for e-grants, that's for Andy Maharis's question about the, yeah, my initial response would be, send them our way and we can get that set up. And I don't know how many would actually do that, or if that's how often that's happened. But it is a requirement. And it's just a transparency thing, so that they have, the right to basically verify that they've received the correct information regarding the funding. So once the plan is, basically once you actually start to put together a plan after discussion, it should really be based on the needs assessment and however the non-public is doing that. Or it could be modeled after the way that the public school, their needs assessment, and if it's a similar population, maybe that would work in that situation. But talking through that, again, what supplies will be needed to run the program in the private or the homeschool, what types of PD what type of PD will be needed to, if there's new teachers, if there's teachers that there's something new with the plan that they haven't been trained up on, how is that going to happen? When is that going to happen? Again, what type of assessment will be used to determine progress? Obviously, public schools are required, there's state required assessments that are used for this. Private schools are not bound to that. So come into agreement on that assessment. And then how would the student be identified as exiting? In other words, when would they be have the achievement gap closed to a point that they are no longer need these services because they're on par with their peers in terms of where they are with their academic skills and achievement? And then how will, the program will be evaluated at the end of each year, so that, we can decide what worked, what didn't work. Do the services need to be tweaked? Does the delivery need to be tweaked somehow? All of that stuff, so that going into the plan for the next year, it's been done after, thoughtful and meaningful evaluation. I see another question. Will we know the equitable share amount by the time we do the consultation process prior to July 31st? I believe you will. I think when you get your allocations, which should come fairly soon, or your preliminary allocations, that will be included in that. As far as the overall program assessment, again, it should be assessed every year. Students there should be an assessment before entry, again, to establish that need based on the academic achievement gap. Then during the year to be monitoring their progress, and then at the end of the year to see how much the growth and how much they've grown throughout the year. And then what will the next steps be as you prepare for the upcoming year. So in terms of the allocation, again, there has to be some type of data source to determine the poverty. I mentioned census counts, TANF, free and reduced lunch, if they're on Medicaid, if there's, if they're in some type of community assistance or proportionality. And then private schools can actually do this every 2 years with those eligible students. So again, the equitable share, again, it is part of that overall allocation, and then they would look at, what percentage of those eligible students in that district would qualify. And again, that I know that I'm just thinking as I'm talking about that question about outside the boundaries, how that might impact that. So I will try to circle back. So I understand that completely, and I provide you good guidance on that. But obviously, the more students are reported, from that poverty population count, the more that number goes up and the more that equitable share would go up. One thing that is a little different with that set aside is that it needs to be expended in the allocation year. Whereas with like with title, you can carry over like 15%. That same provision doesn't apply to if you don't spend all of your money out of that set aside for the privates. Now, I guess the circumstance would be if there's a very unusual circumstance, I would say, then we could provide a waiver. So for example, let's say your community at the start of the year, there was massive wildfires or an earthquake or, some type of what we call an act of God that somehow prohibited you from starting your program right away, or then once you did get started, you didn't have staffing in place to serve those students. And that resulted in a substantial, amount of funds that weren't spent. Then we could provide a waiver, but again, that should be rare. And as a general rule of thumb, those funds don't carry over. So how should those funds be used? Again, the services must be equitable, meaning if you compare what each group of students receives or individual student receive, whether it be public or non-public, they should be basically the same. Sometimes people are tempted to use these funds just to buy equipment and supplies because they see it as a pot of money and they see those needs for equipment or supplies. But you can't have equipment and supplies if you don't have a program. And so, roughly 2/3 of your set aside funds should go for salaries and benefits. And then the remainder would be for PD and supplies. And again, all of this, even supplies, like if it's, let's say it's laptops or Chromebooks or something like that, that the students might be using to do some type of, math software or something like that, some type of program that helps them with their skills. Those, they might be at the non-public entity, but it's very important to know everybody needs to be on the same page about that they are still the property of the public school, and whether that's if they're somehow tagged or something like that, they probably should be inventoried periodically to make sure that in the event of an audit, you can say, yeah, those are ours and this is where they are. All those things. And just in my conversations with folks, as I've kind of started into this, I've heard we gave them, or we did, you didn't give them anything. You purchased it for them to use, but it's just an important distinction is that all of the supplies basically belong to the public school, even though they're serving non-public students. So what type of services? So again, the LEA would design the services, but there would be input from the private school that they should again supplement and be coordinated with the regular program. So build on what they already have in a strategic way versus replace it somehow. So some of the types could be instructional services, some type of extended day activity or enrichment, family literacy, counseling, computer-aided instruction, home tutoring. Those would be examples of services that could be provided. And then they must be secular, neutral, and non-ideological. Again, just making sure that that is done correctly in terms of keeping any kind of faith-based content or services or political out of it. Another question, will this continue until the child is 18 or 19? Yeah, I mean, if they are still an eligible high school student, they would still qualify if they met the poverty, if they met all the other requirements in the attendance area, met the poverty count, had the identified academic need. So, so for, the targeted assistant students, they should be set up, just like a normal targeted assistance program. They should be based on, students should be, they should be prioritized based on their, educationally related criteria. And again, I kind of already mentioned this, materials and supplies purchased must supplement the regular educational program. So, service providers, so if they are a teacher, or a paraprofessional, that are employed by the LEA, they must be licensed, according to state licensure laws. So again, if they're gonna be, teaching a title math course or a title reading course, they would need to be certified in those areas. Now, third-party providers don't necessarily have to be certified teachers, so that's a little different. And then again, all staff who are paid with Title I funds are employees of the public school during that instructional time, unless it's a contractual situation, like an outside entity contractual situation. As far as professional development, it should be part of the meaningful consultation and be useful and high quality for public and private school staff. Should be equitable, again, paid for by the public school. And this can be shared. So for example, if the public school is offering a title supported PD event, that can, they can basically invite non-public staff that are serving those eligible students, which generally in a private school, if they're pretty small, it's probably going to be most, because most of those students are going to be served by almost every teacher in there. But again, that's part of the consultation process, talking through the PD, right? I mean, schools, generally have their PD stuff mapped out, a year ahead. And so how do you make sure that in that process, you're looping in those non-public teachers so that they have those PD opportunities, or if they have PD opportunities that they would like to pursue under this funding, that's all talked through and plans are made, basically. As far as administrative costs, yes, they are allowable. They have to meet those three things. They have to be allowable, allocable, and reasonable. So always making sure that whatever is being paid for is reasonable for what is being purchased or provided. And they would just be part of that set aside, go to those administrative costs. Third-party administrative costs are allowable. So if they're working with a contractor, they would, if they built some administrative costs into that contractual agreement, then that's allowable. Basic equipment, furniture. So if there's a need for, if they're setting up a reading lab or something like that, and they need to purchase desks or tables or something like that, or if they were to lease those, or any costs to maintain equipment, if transportation would be necessary to provide those services off-site, any of those things would be allowable administrative costs. One thing that would not be allowable would be if the non-public school said, hey, we want to put an addition on our school, we're going to put a reading lab in here, and we're going to use those title funds, or have the public school use those title funds to do that. that would not be allowable. But you're essentially your basic, reasonable, normal, necessary administrative costs to run a program would be allowable expenditures. As far as purchasing, all that is done by the public school using their forms, and they're following their procurement policies and procedures. If in the event of PD that would require, you know, some out-of-state travel or something like that, and that was made available to those non-public teachers, you know, airline tickets, major expenses would be covered, would be paid basically by the public school and charged out of that set aside. Again, no funds go to the private school. They can reimburse. So let's say there was an out-of-state PD, you had some non-public staff that attended that. When they got back, they could be reimbursed for basic per diem, parking, you know, those maybe you know, taxi fees, you know, from the airport to the hotel, you know, some of those types of basic things, they could be reimbursed by the public school district on their, you know, policies and procedures. And again, these are the types of things that you would want to have set up during the consultation process, not say in March where the non-public says, oh, hey, by the way, we'd really like to send, you know, 5 teachers to this training, and can we get this done, you know, in the next 3 days or something like that. It's just, it's easier for everybody if those things are done ahead of time as part of the bigger picture planning process. So a little bit about Title II. Again, this is, you know, this funding is for supporting effective instruction. So the services that are provided to teaching staff, essentially administrators, people that are actually doing the instruction and services to the students. Again, they should be part of the needs assessment, the growth plans of the teachers or the teaching staff. And so again, those should be made available to the private school staff. It should be equitable in terms of whatever the costs. You know, if you, let's say you had a PD event and you had, you know, 95% of the participants were from the public, 5% were from the non-public. You would, you know, 95% of the overall costs would be charged out of the public schools general title budget, and then the other 5% would come out of that set aside pot of money. So again, the private school, as a part of that, they need to have a needs assessment that shows why that PD is needed, what professional growth needs to happen. I already talked about that, you know, they can open their PD events to private staff. So this third bullet from the bottom, this is kind of an interesting one. So if a private entity were to say, hey, you know, we're planning to send our teachers to this National Catholic Schools Conference that's held in, I don't know where, St. Louis every year. Can you pay for that out of the Title II funding? The answer is yes, but it would have to be done proportional to the percent of that conference that was focused on that neutral, secular, non-ideological PD. So for example, if you know, 3 of the days were just focused on, you know, basic student instruction and best practices, and then 2 of the days had some faith-based elements to them, basically 60% of that conference cost would, you know, you could prorate it at 60%, that would be provided for that event through the set aside. And again, they can reimburse folks for costs. They couldn't, you know, provide a stipend or something like that for those members to attend. And then just Christy Hendricks is a great member of our team, and she is the Title II expert, and that's her contact information. And she's a veteran teacher and a veteran person here at the OPI. Yes, I am going to share the slides. I will, after today, I will create a PDF of this slide deck and send it out to everybody. So Title III is for English language learners or students who have limited English proficiency, which impacts their academic growth and achievement. So schools can use, if there's Title III funds available, they could use those funds to serve eligible non-public students with language instruction and educational programs that are helping them improve their achievement and their English proficiency, and obviously their core academic knowledge and skills. And it's all designed to help them meet their state academic standards and develop proficiency in English language. They are related but distinct. Title 4A is more whole child supports. Things that would go outside of the core education programming into things like college and career exploration, wellness, technological exploration, proficiency, things like that. And it's just intended to help them just overall be more well-rounded and have a broader understanding of all of the potential career and different opportunities that are out there for them, with the idea that that's going to help them kind of see a path for themselves beyond school that they're going to get excited about, and it's going to help them be more successful. So a little bit about transfer. And so this is something that can impact the non-public, and a lot of times schools will take their Title II, Title III, Title IV funds and decide to roll them into their Title I-A and use them just for more general Title I objectives. And if that is, and this can happen after consultation. So during the consultation process, there could be a whole conversation about this is what's going to be, this is how those non-public teachers are going to be served with Title II, or this is how their EL students are going to be served with Title III. But if the public school at any point says, well, you know what, we're actually going to just roll that back into Title I, they can do that, and the private school really doesn't have recourse on that. But if they roll that into Title I, that means that the equitable share in that set aside would go up proportionally to whatever that amount is. So, just looking at those student numbers and then prorating based on the number of those students that were non-public students, that set aside would have to increase proportionally by that much. So that is something, and it can be, I guess, contentious, but that is something that the public school can do that has an impact on the non-public. So a little bit about the e-grant system. I'm not gonna go in there. I'm not gonna again, kind of like Andy with his with what he was sharing, the screen that I have isn't the screen that you would see, so it's not useful. But this is the system that the OPI uses to basically as our pass-through function to take the federal dollars and allocate them out to schools. They all go into their allocation in the e-grant system. That's where they put their application. That's where they make amendments. If they roll funds, back into Title I, all of those types of things happen within e-grants. But there is a set aside listed in there for private schools, and again, that's that whole question of that whole issue of the private entities being able to go in and look at that. And so you can see how much they get, how much is allocated into each of the programs. And then how they're gonna be used, there's budget categories, so how much is, 100 is personnel services, 200 is benefits. I believe it's 600 is like would be contracted services. So all that's broken down of exactly how they're going to spend all that money in those different categories. And so I was in a minute, I'm gonna stop sharing the slides and go to our website. But I just took a screenshot and I couldn't get the whole thing in there, so I apologize, but basically this is the top, the bottom, I guess, or the middle of that page. I just wanted to show you where you can find that private school tab. So that if you're looking on our website, that's the tab that's gonna have all the information and then also the forms and stuff like that. But I'm gonna stop sharing this. And then. There it is. So this is the OPI website. So to get to our page, the federal programs page, you go up here to leadership. And then if you go over to academic success and then down to federal programs, this brings you to our page. And so here's the private schools tab that I was sharing on that slide. But real quick, I'm just going to show you. So down here is the button. This has our staff and all of our contact information. And so here's mine. Here's Christy. Christy is Title 1D, so neglected, delinquent, foster care. She handles that program as well. Angela Branspall does the migrant is 1C, which is migrant education. I don't believe we have private schools that participate in that one. I haven't heard of that. Also down here is Serena Wright. Serena will be moving into Title III, but she has a vast array of experience with Title I, homeless, family engagement. She came to us from California, and she's been doing this a long time, so she's very knowledgeable, and she's awesome. She's very customer service oriented. And then Kimberly Rebich would be more of your monitoring questions, reporting questions, those types of things. And we will be bringing on another person who will be taking over some of Serena's duties. But anyway, that's how you find us if you need to email us or call us. But if you go on this private schools tab, you come down here, and this is an accordion. Each of these accordion, this one just gives the language about flexibility and accountability. This is if there was a complaint from a non-public, this just outlines the process, and then how they send it to me. We do have, this one is being recorded and will be on here. Here's one that from 2020 that my predecessor Jack O'Connor did. And then here's the PowerPoint. And again, I'll be sharing this stuff with you and on here. Here's a list of the private schools. And so you can look at that, and then it has their equitable share amounts. This is just a lot of the guidance. So you see at the bottom there, the non-regulatory guidance from May 2023, the participation letter. So this is just a good place to get information if you have questions or trying to find answers to stuff. This is a good place to come for that. And then the forms are down here, so I mentioned the interlocal agreement that needs to come to me on July 31. You can download it from here. Here's the affirmation of consultation. If you have private schools that are serving a homeless population, there's a guidance document. And then the equitable share agreement are all located here. So that's kind of where you find everything on our webpage related to this. And so. So are there any questions? I just put my contact information up there. Hold on. If there are none, thank you for attending. And again, thank you for all you do. I know this is a lot of work and there's a lot of things that have to be worked through, but just appreciate your commitment to your students and to those students that you're serving, even if they are with a non-public entity. But if there are no questions, yeah, you can sign off, and you know how to get a hold of me if you have other questions. Yep, you bet. Happy to help. Okay, there was a question. Hold on, let's see. The interlocal agreement is between you and the private school. Yes, that is correct. You guys are welcome.